But good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining this session. I think we probably all understand and agree that at the moment, trust in big tech is eroding. And, with geopolitical tensions amongst both our friends and unfriendly nations, it's a time where many governments and many companies are reevaluating their strategy of data, storage, compute, and of course, the future of their AI. And therefore, today, the UK is really in a pivotal moment for us to decide the future of sovereignty and what sovereignty means to us. So today, the curveball, I was going to introduce Sir Francis Maude, or Lord Maude. Lord Maude was a 25-year frontbench politician, someone I've known for 15 years, joined the back on the front bench in May 2010 and under David Cameron as the Cabinet Office Minister and Paymaster General. And for the first 5 years, through 2010 to 2015, led something called the ERG Group, the Efficiency and Reform Group in government. In fact, we'll be introducing Sir Jacob shortly, who took over that mantle from Lord Maude several years later. But as head of the ERG Cabinet Office, he is on record of saving over £50 billion to our Treasury through efficiency in government. And for those of you that are working in IT, if you remember back in 2010, we talked about the oligopolies. There were 8 very large companies in the UK, people like IBM, Fujitsu, Capita, Capgemini, and others. And those 8 companies, quite frankly, had a stranglehold on government IT. 80% of all spend in government on IT went through those 8 companies. And Sir Francis saw that as a big issue as part of the ERG, and it was actually fundamental in introducing a competitive framework that those of you that know of the public sector, it was called G-Cloud. And that was instrumental in starting to break those oligopolies of our IT. The curveball, though, unfortunately, Lord Maude is not able to join us, or hopefully is on his way, and therefore he was going to say a few words to frame this conversation and give his view of the digital priorities that Britain should have. Hopefully he will be here at the end of the conversation, and I will reintroduce him without that long spiel, and he can share his views. But until then, I'm absolutely delighted that we have got a very distinguished panel of politicians, business people, researchers, and commentators that are going to join me up on stage for that debate. And perhaps you could all join me now. Thank you. Now, we haven't spoken before this session, and anyone that's been to these conferences know that there's a pretty standard way of doing it. Days before, a set of standard questions are sent out, and the panelists know the answers and come all pre-prepared. It's not going to happen today. I did send you the questions, but it's not necessarily what we're going to be talking about.
That's really good to hear.
That makes me a lot more nervous, and similarly you, but hopefully makes it a more interesting panel session than the obvious pre-canned answers. But maybe we could start by quick introductions, and David, maybe not only a quick introduction of yourself, but your initial view of sovereignty.
Sure. So my name is Dave Michels, and I work for the Cloud Legal Project at Queen Mary University of London, where for the past 8 years, I've been studying the legal implications of using and providing cloud services. Now, our research is funded by Microsoft, and I've recently also received some funding from Broadcom to look specifically at the notion of sovereign cloud. But while we have industry funding, we retain full academic independence. So the views I'm sharing with you today are my own, based on my research, and don't necessarily represent those of our funders or my employer. If we think about digital sovereignty, we've been looking at it mainly from a customer perspective, as being all about the level of control that you as a customer can exercise over the IT resources that you use.
Rather than carry on with the introductions, maybe just a quick, has anyone got anything to add around their definition of sovereignty or digital sovereignty? Ben, please, and therefore please introduce yourself as well.
Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for the double curveball in terms of the non-pre-prepared questions. I'm Ben Spencer, MP for Runnymede and Weybridge, and Shadow Science and Tech Minister for His Majesty's Opposition. And I've been in this role for just coming up to a year in the shadow role. I was first elected as an MP back in 2019. For me, when we're talking about sovereignty and the, in some ways related but different concept of autonomy, the underlying prerequisite is choice. Choice. It's up to the person, the institution, the organisation, to make decisions which work best for them, but they need to have choice. We need to have a functioning market for that to operate. So whether you're happy with your data being in our jurisdiction, being in other jurisdictions, subject to whatever legal framework or extra-jurisdictional legal framework is under operation, you should have the choice to do that works for you and your institution. And I think one of the key things that we need to do, you guys are the experts in terms of delivering this stuff and designing it. You know, I mean, politicians should stay way away from that, and the state way away from that, is to understand what we need to put in place to make sure that whatever level you're operating at, you have the ability to exercise choice, whether that's making sure that I'm not in a position in Parliament where I have to raise questions about government procurement, which is at the moment quite limited to several of the big organisations, making sure the CMA, which it is doing its job in terms of approaching things, but also making sure that the domestic environment is a pro-business, pro-enterprise one, which means ensuring the inputs are low and are competitive. That means cheap energy. That means the ability to build domestic compute. That means a workforce that knows how to do this stuff and which is proactive. And I think that's, for me, the mechanisms to get sovereignty, to get true choice in this sort of sector.
Great, thank you, Ben. Greg, not only an introduction, but your views on what Ben said and choice?
Well, my name is Greg Noone. I'm the editor of a publication called Tech Monitor. We try to explain digital trends pertinent to a C-suite audience. And in terms of sort of my personal definition of digital sovereignty, I kind of hew more towards sort of the definition given over by Mike Bracken, who ex-GDS, now partner at Public Digital. And you know, he broadly defines it as the ability for us as a country to make safe, informed decisions about our national tech stack. Now, I think I'd add to that by saying that I believe there is a role, not a massive role necessarily, but a proactive role that can be played by the state in enhancing that digital sovereignty, doing the conventional things like defending our interests in terms of cybersecurity, but also trying to create these types of national champions that we see in Europe, like Mistral AI in France can't move for a sort of a picture of President Macron with Arthur Mensch, you know, sort of schmoozing on stage and talking about France's national AI capabilities, or Germany's Helsing, for example. You know, we have, you know, I think there is more and more evidence to show that the UK can play a more proactive role in creating these national champions and trying to solve this persistent problem within our tech sector of, you know, we have this vibrant tech sector full of amazing companies, but we don't have, you know, the Ubers, the Microsofts, the, you know, all of these kind of big unicorns. So that's where I'm coming from.
Absolutely agree with you. Jacob, I mean, politicians have got an awful lot of topics and a broad range of interests and things they need to care about. Is digital sovereignty one of those? Is it something of concern?
Well, first of all, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and secondly, I wouldn't be here if it weren't of interest. That's a key reason for my accepting your kind invitation. But I'm the sort of hereditary bearer of the flame of sovereignty in relation to this, because my father co-authored a book called The Sovereign Individual with Jim Davidson, in the late 1990s. And this has been formative in my understanding of sovereignty, and I think we're seeing it happening, that we are moving very much to the sovereign individual. And I think states in the 21st century are exactly the same as states at the beginning of the 16th century trying to regulate printing. And they're trying to say what is good for you, what is bad for you, what you should look at, what you shouldn't look at, just waiting for Holy Mother Church to come out with the index of approved websites, which no doubt will be working its through the Curia in Rome at the moment, and we'll get it in about 50 years' time at the rate at which they go. The authoritative list of websites and so on, and activities and AI mechanisms that are good for you. And I think ultimately it will be down to individuals, and governments will try all sorts of things that they will find very, very difficult to implement, because as the sovereign individual argues, people will be able to jurisdiction shop to go to places that have more friendly environments. And this is of fundamental economic importance, as you're already seeing with the massive over-regulation in the EU and the lighter regulation in the US. Who is winning?
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to discussing a lot more about some of those points. Let's just go back to that definition of sovereignty. And David, we often, the last couple of years, the debate is about sovereignty. It's been data sovereignty versus data residency. Is there a difference? Does it matter? And then when we've talked about sovereignty, often the use case or the concern has been about the US Cloud Act. And could the US federal authorities have access to our data? I'd love your comments on that, but most importantly, is that the extent of the sovereignty argument, or is there more to it?
Thanks, Simon.
And I'm going to share that with others as well.
Sure. So I started by saying that sovereignty on a broad notion is all about the customer being able to exercise control over the IT resources they use. And I think that includes things like having a say in where your data are stored, who can access those data, and for what purposes those data are used. But the term is also used in a narrower sense to express a set of concerns about the use of cloud providers who are subject to foreign jurisdictions. And there I think there are really two key concerns. The first is about confidentiality. The question here is, will your cloud provider hand over your data to a foreign government under foreign law without telling you? Right? Or simply put, if you're using a US cloud service provider, can a US intelligence agency secretly read your emails? So that's the first concern. The second concern is about availability. Right? And here the question is, can a foreign government order your cloud provider to stop providing services to you? Right? Simply put, does President Trump have a big red button that he could push to cut you off from your cloud? And if the answer to either of those questions is yes, then I think that risk of foreign government interference undermines your digital sovereignty. But your question was, what role does residency play in that? Right? So is it helpful to have your data stored here in the UK? And I think my answer is it can be helpful depending on what you're trying to achieve. Right? So having data stored closer to the customer can have performance benefits. Right? It might reduce latency. And there can also be a security benefit. Let's say there's a massive geopolitical crisis and Russia cuts subsea cables. In that case, you'll be very happy to be using servers here in the UK. But if we're talking about protecting the confidentiality and the availability of your data, then just having data stored here in the UK isn't going to cut it. Because under US law, the US government can order a cloud provider to hand over your data regardless of where those data are stored. Similarly, even if you're using servers here in the UK, if President Trump imposes sanctions upon you or upon a particular member state, then a cloud service provider that is subject to US jurisdiction will need to stop providing services. And so they'll have to cut you off from those servers regardless of where they are placed. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense, and I'm going to touch on a couple of those use cases later on in the questions, because I'm not sticking to the agenda.
That's fine.
Greg, you spend a lot of time commentating on the public sector. Mm-hmm. And, with what Michael has just said, do you think that's widely understood in the public sector about, potential kill switches, US potential access to data?
I mean, somewhat, from my understanding of it, and I think, I'm coming at this from, I'm the overall editor, I'm a bit of a generalist. I've been obviously pouring my heart and soul into preparing for this panel, but from my understanding, you've got a lot of quite sensitive data within the UK government that has quite high walls surrounding it. So I would say that there is an appreciation at the very highest level for the most secure applications. I mean, more broadly, no, I don't. I sort of agree with Johan in that sense. Yeah.
Ben, I come to Weybridge very frequently. I'm a member of the David Lloyd Health Club at Brooklands. Do you think, the fellow people in the gym, your voters, do you think that they would care or understand or care that their health record, their police record, their prison record potentially could be accessed by non-UK governments?
Well, I think, firstly, great. I'm glad a fellow Weybridgian is on the panel. So I think it really goes back to exactly who is using the data, what the data is being used for. And this is where it's important to always think about regulation proportionately. My default position should always be government should stay out of way and stay out of things. And there needs to be a high threshold for any regulation or government intervention, going back to what Jacob's points were in terms of the chilling and anti-competitive effect. But clearly, there's going to be different requirements for different types of data. A company which is manufacturing drones for use in conflict is going to have different requirements than a local authority which is managing welfare claims, which is going to have different requirements to an NHS cloud server which is managing HIV diagnosis and treatment, which is going to have a different requirement to Heathrow, which is a private company but managing critical infrastructure, which is going to have a different requirement to a health club. And what we need is, certainly when you look at the basic consumer level, whether you're going to a health club or a high street chain, really the primary point should be the market solving that. Those companies should have a think about what suits them in terms of their risks and make a decision. They need to have options available in terms of what they can go to as a private consumer of cloud services myself, to think about how sensitive my data is and whether I am concerned that the US Cloud Act could impact it or not, or whether I'm concerned about the network could be subject to reporting requirements under NIS2 if it's in the EU. The point I want to really stress is none of that really works if we don't have a vibrant free market when it comes to creation and procurement of cloud services. And the primary thing is to make sure that domestically we have that. It's great that we've got the big investment coming in from the States, from some of the big companies, which I hope will act as first adopters in terms of driving forward some change, but we need to have the environment so that many of the companies and people in this room can flourish, can sell their products to UK companies, and we can compete and hyperscale, and when they hyperscale, stay here and not have to go abroad in terms of hyperscaling. And I think from my perspective as government intervention, that's primarily what we should be looking to.
Great, absolutely. So Jacob, last week we saw some big announcements by US tech making, I think it totaled 31 billion into Britain, into AI. What's your views on those investments?
Investment in the UK is obviously welcome, but high-level investment announcements around government events aren't what really matters. What really matters is regular day-to-day, year-by-year investment coming in. And it's quite interesting, the Times was noting today that Apple was not one of the companies that was investing. And why is that? Because Apple feels that there is a slightly unfriendly environment towards it and the backdoor way of getting into it's information that we're not even meant to know has happened, but somehow we do. So I think we are not friendly enough, but the real problem is actually our energy prices, which Ben touched on, rather more than anything else, that we all know that AI uses prodigious amounts of energy. Our average industrial electricity price is 4 times that of the United States, and that in itself is a deeply misleading figure, because that includes places like California that have very high energy prices. When you look at the cheap states, we're running about 7-8 times the cost of energy in the cheaper US states. And that is the biggest disincentive to high energy usage, AI and other applications coming in to this country.
Absolutely. Allow me to do a totally off-piste question to an ex-government minister. You've been on stage previously and made many, many big announcements, and when you see an announcement of this kind of level of investment, how much do politicians, do the civil service actually verify that those are realistic amounts that are being spent? 31 billion. Is that landing in Britain?
Or you want me to tell the secrets of the trade? That figure will include all sorts of things that have been announced many times over the last few years. It will be investment that is taking place over many years, and you will suddenly find, as we found with the pharmaceutical sector, that promises of big investment gets made and then cancelled if the economic circumstances aren't right. So those headline figures I don't get too excited about. What matters is day to day. What is really, really important is that we've got a much better regulatory environment for AI than the European Union. That's the biggest advantage that we've got, and our Apple telephones are able to do more already because of that. And the regulatory competitiveness is fundamental. I don't think governments know how to run business. If they did, they'd be in business, and they'd be a good deal richer than most government ministers are. What governments ought to do is get out of the way, let business get on with the business of doing business, and set the environment where business can succeed. That is the challenge. I don't think we meet it at the moment. I think our GDPR regulations are complex and unduly onerous. I think the online safety bill, and I know something about how that was put together, is a terrible mishmash of good and bad ideas, all based on the safety of children, which is, of course, an unassailable political point, but often leads to bad we're all in favour of children being safe, aren't we? Is there anyone here who would vote against that? So you start with that high-level idea, and then you put all sorts of stuff in it that doesn't really work. So that isn't how it should be. And I'm not with Ben on the CMA. I think the CMA doesn't understand competition. I actually think what's really interesting about the tech world is how the unassailable positions become assailable as technology develops. So if we were sitting here in 1980, we'd all have said IBM was completely and utterly unassailable, dominant global tech company that could never be beaten. If we were sitting here in 1990, we'd have said it was Microsoft. In the last few years, we'd have said it was Google. But I don't know about you, but I now use ChatGPT as much, if not more, than I use Google. And that actually free markets, free competition is so much better than competition authorities putting their ugly mitts into things at an early stage in development. And we are still in very early stages of development. They don't know enough about it, and they are fortunately less powerful than market forces.
Ben, do you have a view on what the CMA are and their cloud investigation at the moment?
Well, I was getting worried because I thought, Jacob, we were seeing eye to eye too much in the same panel. And you may remember, Jacob, back when you were Secretary of State, I asking you about regulation of the energy market. It's something that absolutely critical in terms of sorting out. I think when you've got the concerns which have been raised about egress and those other anti-competitive processes which the big cloud providers are doing when they wrap training into things, and the whole too big to fail argument that some of the big providers have, especially when it comes to government procurement contracts, I think there's an important role for the CMA to be involved there. Particularly, I'm glad that they're looking at strategic market status for AWS and for Microsoft. as part of cloud services. I mean, they've recently just taken on some new powers with regards to digital regulation, which we'll see how that pans out in terms of their investigations. But I do get the point. Fundamentally, the free market needs to fix it. And lots of people speculate about the future, and it never really comes to pass. I mean, my favourite quote on that is, if you grabbed hold of a Victorian and said there'd be over 50 million people, 60 million people living in the UK in 2000, they'd say, well, we better start building stables. Yeah. So it's sometimes a bit fallacious for us to make long-term plans when it comes to this sort of stuff.
So supporting the CMA, they are independent of government. But with geopolitical machinations going on, the pressures of Trump, that surely they can't make decisions that will potentially go against government policy.
Let's see what the CMA do. I mean, I think that's a difficult answer, a difficult question to sort of answer, because it presupposes what decisions the CMA are going to make, and also presupposes that there's going to be some sort of influence. I think, I'm quite proud of our institutions. We can have a good debate about how effective we are, and whether they need reform, etc. But I'm always going to stand up for institutions like the CMA.
Very good, very good. Well, certainly, there's some big decisions coming next year, which will affect all of us, not only cloud, but particularly as we move into the AI world. It's very important, what they decide. So I look forward to. David, you talked about, sorry, were you?
I wanted to build on a few of those points, actually, if I may, on the regulation of cloud services. And it goes back to something that Ben said, which is different cloud customers will have different sovereignty needs, right? As you said, it depends on the sector in which you're working, how critical your workloads are, and it depends on the type of data which you're processing in the cloud.
And some workloads have no sovereignty needs whatsoever.
Absolutely. If you're talking about dev test, dummy data, no concern about confidentiality, it goes down, your continuity of service is not affected, it's fine. In other cases, the more critical your workloads, the more sensitive the data, the more protection from foreign government interference you'll need, right? And so in some cases, we'll have organizations that want to use different sets of IT environments for different workloads and for different data sets. And for that to work in a joined up way, those environments need to be interoperable, right? And ideally, if I'm unhappy with my cloud provider, I'm able to switch from one cloud provider to another, right? I'm able to take my data and port it to another cloud provider. I see that as fundamental to any kind of sovereign cloud deployment, right? And that's not what we're seeing in the market at the moment, right? There are real concerns around vendor lock-in, around portability, and around interoperability. And that is actually an area where the EU arguably is ahead of the UK and has, under the EU Data Act, imposed switching obligations on cloud providers and imposed interoperability obligations on providers in order to support healthy competition in the cloud markets and to empower cloud customers. So I think there's an important role there for regulation and for the CMA.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. You touched earlier about suspension of services, or as Trump would call it, the kill switch. Yeah, there's a big potential kill switch sitting on his desk.
I thought that was for his Coca-Cola, but never mind.
Very true. There are some recent cases of where that kill switch has effectively been implemented. Could you share a couple of those?
Yeah, I think the main case most people will have heard about is the situation with the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, a British lawyer who works for the International Criminal Court in The Hague. As a prosecutor, he had opened investigations into Israeli conduct in Gaza and US conduct in Afghanistan. In response, President Trump imposed sanctions upon him personally, and as a result, Microsoft withdrew his access to his work email account. Now, Microsoft was quick to emphasize that they still serve the International Criminal Court as an institution, right? Under those sanctions, they just cannot be part of the supply chain to Karim Khan personally. But since then, the US have announced new sanctions on 4 sitting judges of the International Criminal Court. And so this is very much a developing story, but it illustrates the way in which the US government can exercise power over US cloud service providers in a way that further its interests, which will not necessarily align with those of the UK or the EU.
And we saw a similar thing, let's try and set politics aside, last week with the services to parts of the Israeli military that were cut off.
Similar but slightly different in the sense that that was an operational decision made by Microsoft rather than in response to a US government order. Microsoft, as all cloud service providers, has a set of terms and conditions that govern acceptable use. Intensively surveilling all of the citizens of another state is against those terms and conditions. So I would see that as slightly different than being ordered by President Trump to cut off a customer for US foreign policy interests.
Great. Jacob, Greg, Ben, just same question to all three of you. Jacob, should digital sovereignty be treated as a matter of national security?
Inevitably, it will be, and the US will behave like this, but it's not purely in digital areas that it matters. Bear in mind, dollar clearing is essential to all financial transactions. If the US government wants to get you and sanction you, it doesn't necessarily need to do it by stopping access to the cloud. It can stop you getting any money in your bank account. Global banking does not operate with US nightly clearing. It just doesn't. And so we should never forget the enormous non-military power that the US has to make people behave in the way it wants. And frankly, the ICC prosecutor investigating the US, which is not a signatory to the ICC, was asking for trouble. He got what he deserved. No sympathy for him at all, particularly considering his reputation, which we might leave to one side for the moment. Well, his reputation is quite bad, actually. He's under investigation for all sorts of dodgy dealings. So I'm with the US on using their power. I think they're entitled to, and they will. And other countries will too. China will unquestionably use its power. It's law. It is the Chinese law that Chinese companies have to report information that may be of use to the Chinese state. So there's not another place you can go to easily. The UK government has powers that it can use to demand information. We know that's why Apple has reduced certain services on its telephones, that states do this as a matter of course. States want power. That's why the sovereign individual point is very interesting, and how does the individual get away from this power? It's not easy to do, but I think the development and the evolution of technology will mean that there will be ways you can go where you are independent of this power, but it's going to take time.
Great. Greg, I don't think your answer is going to be as controversial as...
Probably not, no.
Won't be the soundbite, maybe, but please share.
Just to elaborate on sort of the examples pertaining to China, right? And to answer your question, should the UK be in a position to defend its digital sovereignty? Yes, and it has done on previous occasions. And 2022 was a bumper year when it did so across its tech stack, right? Mainly in reference to China. So you've got Huawei being stripped from the UK telecoms network. You've got Nexperia being forced to sell their stake in the Newport wafer fab because of concerns that it was a subsidiary of Wingtech, a Chinese company. And you've also got the issue, which seems to be sort of rumbling on, percolating in the background very subtly. It's the issue of hike vision cameras being absolutely everywhere, and the cameras being connected back to sort of the company, rather, being connected back to the Chinese state. So the UK has, on multiple occasions, defended its digital sovereignty in this regard. I don't believe that, this might be quite an obvious thing to say, but I don't think US intelligence services or US authorities should be functionally in a position to thwart or govern the futures of individuals in the UK, right? That should be, off the table completely, as a matter of principle. I don't think necessarily UK individuals or companies might be targeted in this way. I think we should know where our allies are and where they're not. But I don't think the UK should ever be put in that position in the first place. It's not reassuringly non-controversial.
Indeed. Ben, the kill switch, national security.
So data sovereignty is no different to any critical infrastructure in that it needs protected and needs to be resilient, irrespective of what sort of foreign organisation or whoever has the ability to interfere with it. We live in a world where we have extremely connected supply chains, and really the approaches that we have available are twofold. One is you sandbox, or the other is that you make yourself so enmeshed in a global supply chain that any action has equal but opposite reaction. And I think there's parallels in this area with the whole chip situation. As you know, most high-quality chips, if not all, come from Taiwan. That is a very tight supply chain with strong power from the Netherlands, for example, in terms of the etching, to the UK when it comes to design. We have quite a lot of strength when it comes to quantum tech in terms of UK PLC. One argument to protect ourselves in that area is that if we're so important in the supply chain, we have a degree of insulation from any sort of interference or threats to knock that over. I think digital sovereignty is a good example of that. I can see some examples where you would totally want everything sandboxed. I think we can all think of examples of that in terms of in domestic commute, and there's some where actually it really doesn't matter that much. But the key is that we have the option to do that. And I think part of that option is making sure that the government can procure, or is able to procure from UK-based companies. And I've been concerned for quite some time that, and I have companies come talk to me all the time about this, that they just cannot get through government procurement processes in terms of providing their services, which is something that we really, for a whole host of reasons, we need to fix.
And certainly procurement, anyone that's used to selling into government, procurement is the single biggest issue. But also, I would suggest it's a long-term view of our politicians about some of the long-term decisions that need to be made here, which, by the nature of our politics and the cycle of politics, makes it very hard to take a 15, 20-year view.
I briefly had ministerial responsibility for procurement, and there is an enormous tension in drawing up procurement laws. You want to make it easy for people to apply, to sell their goods, but you want to make it very difficult for fraud. And that is the fundamental tension, that the easier you make it for people to apply and to win contracts, the easier you make it for, particularly at the council level, a contract to be given to somebody's friend. And that's what you're always trying to get the balance. In my view, I was actually responsible for the legislation. I think the legislation still was too inflexible, was too determined to stop any possibility of fraud, rather than making it easier for smaller businesses to apply. But that is what you were wrestling with. And there isn't a perfect answer. And if you remember all the rows we had over protective equipment purchasing, the reason for that was it was done very, very urgently. The decisions were all made by civil servants, not by ministers. But there was fraud in it, and there was too much fraud in it, but that was because it was made easier. And so this is a very serious problem. There isn't a straightforward answer to it. It's just a balance, and I think you keep on readjusting the balance one way or another as you see where your next Procurement Act goes.
I think there's a lot of work that does need to be done still within government to improve the procurement system as it pertains to digital sovereignty, right? I mean, I don't know how familiar everyone is with a National Audit Office report that came out earlier this year, which said that, it's an estimate that the government spends about £14 billion each year on digital services. But because of the scale of departmental fragmentation and sort of all of these contracts whizzing in and out of government, it's impossible to know precisely whether that figure is correct and where that money is going. So more work must be done to unify that system, make it simpler, both for businesses and for government, to achieve sort of, online services, digital services that are more relevant for the public and easier to use. And I think if you crack that, which, there are moves towards doing that, announced by the current government, and the 2023 Procurement Act pushed forward some of that agenda. I think the situation will improve. But unless you crack that, I don't think you'll be able to use, and your mileage may vary on this if you even wanted to see it, but if you want to use government procurement power, which is significant, to try and create the national champions that you see in France and in Germany and in the US and dare I say in China too, you need to crack that. You need to crack that problem.
Well, I've personally spent 10 years battling public procurement, so it's a session I could panel I would love to have, but it's not one for today.
Asking you the questions.
David, your expertise is in the legal understanding and area here. Is there some obvious laws, regulations that could be put in place that you think would help the topic of data sovereignty?
You know what, Simon, I actually think we have the regulations in place that we need. I think whether it comes to processing sensitive personal data or whether we're talking about safeguarding critical infrastructure, we have regulations in place that require companies to engage in active risk management, right? And it's more a question of interpreting that risk management obligation to include this risk of foreign government interference, right? And then thinking about, as we've said, once you've identified your sovereign needs, what are the IT environments or the combination of IT environments that help best meet those needs? Mm-hmm. Right? And what sovereignty enhancing measures can I put in place to reduce the risk of US government access to my data or the US government cutting me off from some sort of critical workload? And that's things like encryption, things like local backups, those kinds of measures.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, Jacob, both of you have expressed, today that, government needs to step aside and allow industry and the market to self-regulate. But are there any obvious policies, legislation that you feel is necessary in future parliaments?
I mean, of course, we've got a piece of legislation which is allegedly coming soon, the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, which I'm sure many people in the room will know a bit about. I say a bit about because it still seems very opaque as to exactly what the scope and content of this bill is. So if you're a service provider, I'm sure you've got loads of questions in terms of what that will actually mean to you and its compatibility with NIS2, exact what it means in terms of definitions. This is something that I'm meeting with people on, trying to get your perspective in terms of what you think about it. I'm completely agnostic on it because I haven't seen it, but I come from the default position. We need to think very, very carefully before we add another layer of regulations. That being said, it would be a bit perverse if we have a situation where, because of cross-cover, there's better reporting systems in the EU for a company doing the same thing that's based in the UK, but because it's got EU clients, it's subject to NIS2 data reporting when it comes to cybersecurity. Extra jurisdictionality is always going to be an issue with all this sort of area. And I don't think it's just limited to data sovereignty. It covers, a whole host of things. We need to think very carefully about if we are going to take more steps, exactly what they are, and ensuring they're proportionate. I do think the argument for that is stronger, though, when it comes to public authorities, when it comes to the private sector, which is managing essential critical amenities, be that the national grid or be that Heathrow. I think the argument becomes very weak when it comes to, let's say, a high street fashion retailer in terms of interference around that. So I think all of this stuff also needs to be proportionate and carefully thought through. We'll see if that's what we get when this bill gets published.
Superb view. I'm going to very shortly open this to the audience to see if there are any questions. I trust my colleagues have got a spare microphone to come around. But Jacob, last comments. Ben mentioned the EU there several times. I think you're somewhat famous to have a view on that. What legislation, if any, is needed in the next Parliament?
Well, I'd actually like to see legislation simplified and repealed. I think we go too far with GDPR, and I think we go too far with the Online Safety Act. And I think we want to make the most of not being in the EU to be as competitive as the United States rather than as regulated as the EU. And I agreed very much with what Ben was saying about proportionality. I would just add one caveat. And the problem all of you in business find with proportionality is that the law says that it must be proportional, and then your in-house legal counsel tells you that to be risk-free, you must be a one step above what actually the law tells you you need to be. And it's not always government gold plating. It is internal risk avoidance that gold plates quite unnecessarily. I do think companies need to take responsibility for their cybersecurity. I obviously think Heathrow is different from a high street chain, but you do risk getting into the situation, and you get into the situation because of the fines that are available under GDPR, which are absurd for honest mistakes. I mean, it seems to me crazy to fine businesses a percentage of their turnover for getting something wrong that has actually harmed their business. They don't do it deliberately. They do it because something's gone wrong, and I think that's bad law. And that needs to be changed so that people know that there's proportionality and they can actually use it rather than feeling that they've got to gold plate it, because all gold plating is cost to business, higher cost for consumers, less profit, less economic growth. And we are over-regulated as a rule rather than under-regulated.
Fascinating. Thank you for those insights. We're going to open some questions before thanking. Sophia, I think you're kind enough, maybe the gentleman down in the front to start with.
Thank you very much. That's all very interesting. As well as being a technology journalist, I'm a technologist. And when I look at the supply chains, rather than the just arm waving at these things, I don't really understand how you can do tech sovereignty. Because a hostile actor, like Donald Trump, or the EU with its, not the Peasants' Charter, the EU AI Act, with their extraterritoriality, if a major bloc wants to mess with us, I just don't see how we can actually stand up against it. If Microsoft, if Donald Trump wanted to extort money from a British company, like he has extorted money from various US broadcasters, there is nothing we could do about that. Literally nothing at all. The practicalities is that they could turn off Marks and Spencer's tomorrow. Though, I mean, given their problems, that's not very hard. But how do we avoid this just being subsidised for local industries? I've got grey hairs here. I remember when steel was a national thing. Every country had to have its own steel industry, otherwise it would be dependent on other countries. And billions and billions and billions were wasted on national champions, British steel, Belgian steel. We even built...
So thank you. I'm conscious there are going to be many other questions. Ben, have you got a quick response?
Well, I think the kit is one that's well worth thinking about, and particularly in terms of embedded SIM cards into devices, which we need to speak a lot more about when it comes to national resilience and influence by foreign actors, particularly China. So I think you're right in the sense that we need to be talking more broadly when it comes to the tech kit, not just about the data supplies. But it goes back to the point I made earlier, which is in terms of asserting data sovereignty from a resilience point of view, there are really two options. One is that you embed yourself in the supply chain so much that you can't possibly turn it off, or that you entirely sandboxed it. Both have their benefits and disadvantages.
Jacob.
Well, I basically agree. I think national champions are a way to lose money and get things hopelessly wrong. There is a chain from ICL as a national champion to the postmasters going to prison. There really is. It was government had to buy that contract because it was the only way of keeping the remnants of ICL solvent, and then people go to prison because it wasn't any good. So we do have a choice of taking some element of risk and some element of basically antediluvian service. And I would take some element of risk with broadly friendly nations. I think it was right to try and get Huawei out of the system, because I think that the relationship with China is going to be exceptionally difficult and more difficult in future years.
I agree with you. I think we need to be realistic about the extent to which we can actually maintain a sense of digital sovereignty in the UK, right? Especially given the multiple decades of underinvestment and this idea that Personally, I think the UK government has on occasion been a bit too beholden to tech giants, and we see some of that in the rhetoric, even with the current government. I think we need to be realistic in terms of the application areas, right? Chips, for example. We don't need to make our own chips, and I don't think we would even have the capacity anymore to make some of these really, really high-tech ones that are made by TSMC. But I do think that the state can use its procurement power, and I keep wanging on about this, but it has 14 billion, it spends, we think, 14 billion pounds per year on digital services. We can use some of that to help solve this problem of this vibrant British tech ecosystem not producing the unicorns that it should be doing. And I think that world is fundamentally different. And I'm a bit more optimistic about it in comparison to the days of British Leyland, for example.
Thank you, Greg. Another question.
Hello, thank you. I'm Dr. Hexmiller Bakewell. Large language models tend to reflect the cultural values of the data that goes into them. There have been comments about the Americanization of language in the House of Commons, for example. And there are American values encoded into that system that are then leaked into the people who use it. Is there an argument for Britain to promote as a cultural artifact its own production of large language models and so on, perhaps with a focus on British systems or minority languages such as Welsh and Gaelic, that are not that favourable to a global market?
Rather shamefully, I was caught out in this introduction of Americanisms in the House of Commons. I think I came in the top 10 of MPs using Americanisms, for which I apologise and eat humble pie. I have a nasty feeling it was because I spoke so much rather than because I had a particular habit of it was a verbosity rather than many Americanisms as a percentage. So I'm guilty as charged. I don't know what we do. I think America is so dominant that it's very hard to get away from that, and it's so leading that anything you get out of AI tends to be American spelling, default American approaches. Like English. American English, yes. And, if I'm then using it, I change it. But people aren't going to bother to do that. And I think it's just one of those much maligned King Canute, who, of course, we all know the story is wrong about poor old King Canute, but nonetheless, we're slightly in that position of trying to hold the tide back, and I have a nasty feeling we won't succeed, even though I will be the last one trying, in spite of evidence to the contrary.
Thank you. I was in India last week, and in a big debate for exactly that, about the need, in their eyes, for an Indian large language model, and there was basis around a very unique culture, language, set of values. So certainly will be true in many countries. Sophia, another question at the back. That was.
Do you,
you choose,
side?
please.
Oh man, I'm going to go right here.
Thank you
And
very
maybe
much.
over that time next time. Thank you for the last question.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Karim, and I'm an account director at Nokia. My question is around technology vendors who provide data center infrastructure and cloud technologies. Should we see data sovereignty as an opportunity to find and win more business, or should we see it as a bit of a risk of losing out on business? Thank you.
So, Greg, maybe you could answer that in context of how's the media shaping that discussion and response?
Well, I would say this. I think that the sort of B2B tech media, so representing I won't say Tech Monitor because that would be too much self-promotion, but Computer Weekly, The Stack, The Register, etc. They've all been doing tremendous work in trying to sort of get the government and these big tech giants on sort of the ins and outs of tech sovereignty. I think the mainstream media has kind of approached this on a little bit of a superficial level. We're in this very sort of curious historical moment where we're still kind of recovering from COVID-related supply shocks, and we've seen the war in Ukraine and instability causing gas prices from that, and we've seen somewhat erratic foreign policy from the second Trump administration, constant murmuring of annexing Greenland, for example. So I think it's kind of borne by that feeling of instability. And when all these tech announcements came as a result of the state visit, a lot of these mainstream publications picked up on the fact that, a lot of big American companies are ostensibly pouring money into the UK economy by creating this extensive AI infrastructure. Now, I don't think that has been drilled in sufficiently by the likes, for example, like BBC News. There was a recent interview with between one of their correspondents and Satya Nadella of Microsoft, and the digital sovereignty question was asked. And are these investments undermining UK digital sovereignty, etc.? Are we just leeching it away to US hyperscalers? And Nadella said no, in a very verbose way, but the interview moved on. I think we need to, I think as a profession, we need to be a bit more,
Absolutely, and that's why we're having this debate today. Exactly. So appreciate your contribution. Maybe one final question, Sophia.
Hi there. I was just curious to know, is there anyone that you know within government who is actively working on creating a blockchain solution for the system that you mentioned, sir, the digital services and all that money being spent on that? Because I feel like, obviously the blockchain is known for being completely transparent. And then, if there was a company that could do that, would you be open to looking at finding out more about that? Or do you already know of companies that are working on that?
So quite a technical question. I'm not too sure that people are going to immediately know the answer to that. Maybe, if I may, I'm going to incorporate into a slightly different question that, the announcement of the current government and digital IDs, and presumably blockchain will be an important part of implementing that. What are your views there?
Well, so whatever you're feeling on national IDs and digitization of IDs, and obviously a digital ID is combines both together, which makes it an even more complicated prospect. All I can say is one would hope that blockchain would be a core data security component of it, and that's being thought about. My concerns about the announcement, to be blunt, is that it seems more timed for political expediency than of something that's been thought through properly in terms of a policy, particularly.
Has that ever happened before in government?
Well, hey, la plus ça change. But particularly the people who are digitally excluded, who the now announcement is so people who don't have smartphones or can't use the internet, there's going to be a consultation on how that works for you. And I'm somebody who voted against COVID passes. That's government, because the impact on the digitally excluded, amongst other things. I really hope, whatever happens with this policy, the government pays far more attention to the detail than it's done so far.
Great. Jacob?
Yeah, but I think Ben's put it perfectly. I think it is absolutely something that's been rushed out because there was a party conference coming. I'm afraid the government's record on IT, as Greg was pointing out, £14 billion, I don't know where it's spent. I think the chances of digital ID working and happening are actually negligible. I just don't see that they will be able to get it all done by the time of the next election, and I expect the next election somebody else will win who will get rid of digital IDs. There's a fundamental change in the relationship between the citizen and the state, that this country has never been a show me your papers culture. Show me your iPhone culture, I don't think will be popular either.
Absolutely.
I'd like to say I'm broadly in favour of it. Oh, you're the one. I'm the one. I'm the one. But my fear would be that this system, however it ends up looking post the consultation, will be contracted out to another very large US tech company. On the sort of, aping the example of Palantir with the federated data platform in the NHS, which, I don't want the future of a national ID system to be defined by sort of several meetings over melon cocktails, as was the case with David Pryor and the UK head of Palantir back in 2019.
Well, I certainly, whatever the outcome of that government policy, I would love to think that digital and data sovereignty is going to be a very important part of that discussion, because where that data is held, where that compute, how that AI is used for the potential digital ID is very, very important. And I hope today's discussion, debate has been of interest and added some insight into those thinking. And I've got to say a big round of applause, please, to my panellists.